Okie dokie. We're looking at the Book of Glory, just a brief overview. So this is chapters 13 onwards. Really, it's just chapters 13 to 20, and we'll talk about chapter 21 when we get to the end. But this is about how he showed the full extent of his glory. Okay, so it starts off with, like, in John 13, the announcement is made. It's just before the feast of the Passover. And as we go through John's Gospel, you realise that little details like that are significant. It's not just saying what time of year it is. It was putting everything into your mind. You've got to think about the Passover. And Jesus is presented in John's Gospel as the Passover lamb. Rather quirkily, the Passover lamb, you might want to bear in mind, was not a sacrifice for atonement. Dun dun dun. Okay, it was actually to turn away the wrath of God. Of course, if you know the story of the Exodus, that they put the blood of the lambs around the doors, and those who were covered by the blood, the wrath of God passed them by. All right, so it's actually a little bit more eschatological than just simply reminding you of the time of year. All right. Now, as we go through the passage, then you find that through the gospel, then you'll find that the last section, chapters 13 through to 20, are very, very significant. It's the focal point of John's Gospel. All right, bearing in mind that the first 12 chapters have covered 3 years of ministry, the last dozen or so chapters, they actually, they cover 3 days. And in fact, 4 of those chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, they cover about 3 hours. So this is a lot, packed into these few chapters. Half a dozen chapters, and you've got a lot more to actually really get your head around, and just that whole perception of the fact that this whole thing just covers a few hours or a few days as opposed to several years or a few years, that tells you that this is really the focal point of John's Gospel. All right, and that in itself is very significant. All right, because it's here that you really hit gold when it comes to theology. You've got, chapter 17, for example, it's a prayer. It's the longest single recorded prayer of Jesus praying to the Father. You've got odd words here and there. You've got the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, in the other Gospels, and you've got the prayer in Gethsemane, just a sentence or two. But here you've got a whole chapter, which is Jesus speaking to the Father. It's a private conversation, well, maybe a public conversation, between 2 members of the Trinity. And you've got to think, that's really powerful. I mean, that really is the jewel in the crown of the New Testament, and when you think about that, it's really powerful. And of course, you've got a full recorded sermon from Jesus. 14, 15 and 16, those chapters are a recorded sermon of Jesus. Now, everywhere else you've got short passages, you've got a parable, you've got a few sayings and things like that, but there you've got a complete sermon directly from Jesus. I mean, it's just mind-numbing. It's just, there's nothing else like it in the whole of the New Testament. And this is why I'm in love with John's Gospel. When I read those passages, I just think, like, this is unique. It is unique. There's nothing else like it anywhere else in Scripture. All right. And so the Paschal Discourse, that speech at the Last Supper, really is the crown of the New Testament leading up to the Passion. And John's portrayal of the Passion, the crucifixion, is subtly different. The basic facts are the same, but the differences that John brings in are hugely significant. And so you've got those few chapters of the Last Supper, and then you've got, of course, the Passion, and everything about it is different. Right, in the Last Supper, in the Synoptics, he gives them the communion. You hardly even get a hint of that in John's Gospel. Instead, you've got foot washing. All right, totally different, completely different take on all of those things. And the thing is that what you find is that because the first 12 chapters, the Book of Glory, Book of Signs, that had a storyline. You find that people gravitate towards that. They'll read that because it's easier to read because there's a story in it. There's a progression, you know. Whereas you find that these chapters are much harder. They're thick with theology. They're really intricate, and there's no storyline in the Last Supper. You know, there's no events. You know, it's Jesus speaking for 3 or 4 chapters. And as such, people find that quite hard to read. You find that it's more quoted, but the verses which are quoted from it are quoted out of context and often badly misunderstood. They're not really appreciated for what they are. So when we get to that, we will go through it quite slowly. All right, we will dig through it, in fact, and really try to bring up all the nuggets that we can. All right. You know, it's that kind of stuff that we really need to do. You know. Now, when it comes to the crucifixion, of course, and the arrest and the trials, he's got all sorts of little details which are quite different from the other Gospels. He's got quite a different sort of angle on it, and some even think that there's a contradiction between John and the Synoptics, because it seems that in the Synoptics, Jesus is crucified per se before the Sabbath, which would make it sort of Friday, but John's Gospel makes it very, very clear that Jesus is crucified the day before the Passover, which causes a lot of confusion. Suffice it to say for now, there is no contradiction, and it's a great study to actually look, but actually a lot of the terms are misunderstood, and the Jewish day is misunderstood as well. We forget that the Jewish day ran from sundown to sundown, not midnight to midnight, and so therefore we get confused. Often we'll say something like the Sabbath is a Saturday. So when would the Sabbath evening be? Oh, well, that would be Saturday evening. No. It's Friday evening. It's the night before. So when it says it's the evening of the such and such a day, it doesn't mean it's the end of the day. It means it's the beginning of the day. And it comes forward 24 hours. All right? Which is very significant when you're trying to work out how Jesus could be in the tomb for 3 days, when you've got a very strong tradition that he was only in the tomb for half of that. You know, from Friday night till Sunday. 36 hours. That's half of 3 days. That can't be right. It isn't right. Okay then. So, you know, there's a few things there that we can pick out, and we'll follow through. There's also other little details in there which are interesting, like the story of Nicodemus. We saw Nicodemus in chapter 3, and, you know, you see him re-emerge in 2 or 3 places, and you see him at the burial of Jesus, and it's quite clear that he becomes a believer. It's even possible that he is actually the eyewitness account behind the conversation in chapter 3. Perhaps John the Apostle wasn't there, but Nicodemus was. So that's a question. It's a theory. It's something to think about anyway. All right then. And so as you go through those chapters, then you find that there are a number of different things. Okay, so from chapter 13, and then of course you move on to chapter 18. There's the second thing, that's the arrest and onwards, and we're going to have a look at this. And then finally at the end you find this purpose of the whole gospel. And this is actually the last verse of John's gospel. Right? He did many other signs which are not written, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. By believing you may have life in his name. And this is a big theme in John's gospel. Life being to know God. Okay, John 17 verse 3, this is life that they may know you. All right, it's to know God. You're dead if you don't know God. You're alive if you do know him. All right, so it becomes a significant theme in that. But then of course you've got John 21. Now John 21 is interesting because in John 21 towards the end it says we know that his testimony is true. So who is we? Who is speaking? Who is writing here? All right. It appears to be it's after John has died. So could it be that actually this last chapter is written by the scribes who supported John, or the disciples of John? Okay. And they're saying we know that his testimony is true because it's clearing up this issue about John living until Jesus comes back. All right. And of course the old man has died and Jesus has not appeared. So what's happening is Jesus let us down. You know, this clears up the question, no, he hasn't. All right. However, it's still part of the inspired text. All right. There's no reason to doubt it, because it's not important who wrote it. It's important who inspired it, and obviously God laid this upon their heart to write, and they wrote under the inspiration of Scripture. All right. So it doesn't make any difference, but that closing verse at the end of chapter 20 is actually the verse that ends the gospel as far as John is concerned. All right. That's his conclusion. That's his closing statement. All right. So that's the Book of Glory. All right. Finally, we can actually get into some studies, and so we're going to look at John 1 next, and we'll be considering the Word. See you then.